One decision is sending shockwaves across the global economy. And this isn't just another headline. It's something that could directly impact energy prices, inflation, and the money in your pocket. Signals from Donald Trump suggest a possible end to military operations involving Iran. At first glance, that sounds like stability, less conflict, lower risk. But there's a critical complication. The Strait of Hormuz, the most important oil choke point in the world, is reportedly remaining closed, and that changes everything. Because when you restrict the flow of energy, you don't just affect one region. You send ripple effects across the entire global system. This is no longer just geopolitics. This is inflation, supply chains, financial markets, and your everyday cost of living. Globe showing Europe, Africa why Hormuz is the artery of the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. But despite its size, it carries enormous weight. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this single corridor. That's not just a number. That's the backbone of global energy. Every single day, over $1 billion worth of oil flows through this route. Now imagine that flow being restricted or even partially shut down. Major economies like China, India, Japan, and South Korea rely heavily on this supply. This isn't optional for them, it's essential. Factories, transportation networks, electricity generation all depend on stable energy flow. If that flow is disrupted, the impact doesn't stay local. It spreads globally. Supply chains tighten. Shipping costs rise. Production slows. And when supply drops while demand stays constant, prices don't gradually increase. They spike. Market reaction, inflation, and the domino effect. Interestingly, the initial market reaction didn't reflect panic. Stock futures actually moved higher. Why? Because markets often react positively to the end of military conflict. Less war usually means lower risk, at least on the surface, but markets are layered. And beneath that initial reaction lies a deeper concern. Markets don't just fear conflict. They fear uncertainty. And this situation introduces a dangerous kind of uncertainty, one tied to energy supply. If oil prices surge, the effects cascade through the economy. Transportation becomes more expensive. Manufacturing costs increase. Food prices rise due to higher logistics expenses. This leads to one key outcome: inflation. And inflation changes everything. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve, are forced to respond. Interest rates go up, borrowing becomes more expensive, consumer spending slows. Business expansion contracts, liquidity dries up. And suddenly, what started as optimism in the markets can quickly reverse into volatility or even a downer. Geopolitics, power shifts, and safe havens. This situation isn't just about economics. It's about global power. If the U.S. reduces its military involvement while the Strait of Hormuz remains restricted, the balance of influence begins to shift. This situation isn't just about economics. It's about global power. If the U.S. reduces its military involvement while the Strait of Hormuz remains restricted, the balance of influence begins to shift. Countries like China, a major importer of Middle Eastern oil, face immediate strategic pressure. Energy is not just a resource. It's leverage. And restricting access to it can function as a form of economic warfare. This creates a new kind of tension, not necessarily military, but financial and strategic. In times like this, investors start looking for safety. Historically, that means gold. More recently, Digital assets like Bitcoin have also entered the conversation as alternative safe havens. When trust in systems weakens, capital moves. Some markets fall. Others rise sharply. Volatility becomes the new normal. What we are witnessing right now is not a simple policy shift. It's a high-stakes trade-off, one with consequences that extend far beyond politics. At the center of this situation is a fundamental tension: stability in geopolitics versus stability in the global economy. On one side, signals from Donald Trump suggest a move toward reducing military engagement. Historically, that kind of shift lowers immediate geopolitical risk. Less conflict often means fewer disruptions, more predictability, and improved investor confidence. But this time, the equation is different because the Strait of Hormuz remains restricted. And that introduces a completely different kind of risk, one rooted in energy supply. This creates a paradox. Geopolitical tension may decrease, while economic tension simultaneously increases. And in a globalized system, energy is not just another commodity. It is the foundation of everything, from transportation networks and global shipping to manufacturing, agriculture, and even digital infrastructure. Energy powers it all. So when that foundation is constrained, the entire system feels the pressure. Now, let's break this down more deeply. If oil supply remains restricted, prices will not simply rise, they will become volatile. And volatility is far more dangerous than high prices, because volatility creates uncertainty. And uncertainty freezes decision-making. Businesses delay investment. Consumers reduce spending. Markets become reactive instead of predictive. This is how slowdowns begin, not with collapse, but with hesitation. At the same time, governments face a difficult dilemma. Do they prioritize economic stability or geopolitical strategy? Because solving one may worsen the other. If they intervene to stabilize oil supply, they may escalate tensions. If they step back to avoid conflict, they risk prolonged economic strain. There is no perfect solution, only trade-offs. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Now expand this to the global level. Major economies like China and India are highly dependent on imported energy. A prolonged disruption doesn't just increase costs for them, that it slows growth. It weakens currencies. It shifts global economic balance. Meanwhile, energy-exporting nations may gain short-term advantages from higher prices. But even that comes with risk. Because extreme price spikes can reduce demand over time and accelerate the transition to alternative energy sources. So even the winners in this scenario face long-term uncertainty. And then there's the financial system. When instability rises, capital does not stay still. It moves. Investors begin reallocating assets, from risk-heavy sectors to defensive positions, from growth stocks to commodities, from traditional systems into alternative stores of value. This is where we often see increased attention on assets like gold, and increasingly, digital assets like Bitcoin, not because they are perfect solutions, but because they are perceived as protection against systemic risk. So what you end up with is a fragmented market. Some sectors decline under pressure. Others surge due to fear-driven demand. And volatility becomes the defining characteristic of the entire system. Now bring this back to the individual level, because ultimately, all of this complexity leads to simple, real-world effects: higher fuel prices, more expensive goods, increased cost of living, tighter financial conditions. This is how global decisions translate into everyday reality, not instantly, but inevitably. And that brings us to the core question of this entire situation. Is this a strategic recalibration of global priorities? or a miscalculation that underestimates the importance of energy stability. Because in today's world, power is no longer defined by military strength alone. It is defined by control over resources, supply chains, and economic influence. And right now, all three are being tested at the same time. This is not just a moment, it's a shift. A shift that could redefine how nations balance security, economics, and global influence moving forward. The outcome is not yet clear, but one thing is certain. The effects will not stay contained. They will move through markets, through industries, and ultimately into everyday life. So the question is no longer if this matters. The question is, how prepared are we for what comes next? Please subscribe channel, don't forget.